His corpse was so bloated and foul that the coffin burst open, spilling blackened fluids onto the chapel floor. The once mighty King Henry VIII, ruler of an empire and destroyer of queens, died not with majesty but in stench, secrecy, and spiritual terror. For 3 days, his death was hidden from the world. His legs were rotting while he breathed, and even after death, his body refused to stay still. How did the most powerful monarch in English history come to such a gruesome end? What secrets were buried along with him, and why were some never spoken aloud again? These are the 10 disturbing hidden truths about Henry VIII's death you were never taught in school, but once heard, they'll haunt you forever. Fact 1. The silent death of a monarch. On a bitter winter night in late January of 1547, behind the veiled tapestries of Whitehall Palace, the body of King Henry VIII finally gave in. The room was still, heavy with the stench of decay and the muffled breath of courtiers too afraid to grieve aloud. England's most feared and formidable monarch, the man who defied the Pope, created his own church, and executed wives with impunity, lay lifeless in his chamber. But outside those guarded doors, there was no mourning bell, no proclamation to the people, no royal trumpet sounding the passing of a sovereign. Instead, a profound and deliberate silence swallowed the court. For 3 days, the kingdom was ruled by a ghost. The king was dead, but no one was allowed to know. Within the Privy Council chambers, the air pulsed with quiet urgency. Advisors, scribes, and power-hungry nobles moved like shadows, issuing orders and stamping decrees. But there was one glaring omission. The king's hand never moved. Instead, they used a carved block of metal bearing the monarch's signature, the dry stamp pressed onto parchment by council members, desperate to finalize land grants, secure titles, and shift power before word of the death reached the realm. Henry's body may have stopped breathing, but his name was weaponized posthumously to rewrite England's future in ink and ambition. What does it mean when a king continues to rule from beyond the grave? The answer lies not in legacy, but in manipulation. The delay in announcing his death was not a gesture of respect, nor a matter of decorum. It was a tactical pausia final move in a long game of courtly survival. While the masses toiled unaware, decisions made in his name would outlive him. The reality of his death was too dangerous to declare. The vacuum of power could have incited rebellion, opened the gates to foreign threats, or triggered factions within his own court to devour each other in a frenzy of opportunism. The irony is brutal. For a man obsessed with authority, whose very breath once sent nobles into tremors, his passing was met not with reverence but with censorship. Even death did not grant him the dignity of truth. His image bloated, broken, hidden behind velvet drapes stood, in stark contrast to the golden portraits that once immortalized him as a warrior king. Now, he was a cadaver behind a curtain, concealed by fear. But the silence would not last. The corridors of power could not contain the inevitable rot. Whispers began to coil through the palace halls, curling beneath doors, bleeding into the prayers of servants and the tremors of scribes. And when the truth did come, it came not with glory, but with something far more grotesque, because hiding his death was only the beginning. What they were about to uncover would not just rewrite a reign, it would stain it with blood, pus, and the stench of a body that refused to rest. Fact 2. The leg that never healed. It began with a thunderous crash, steel on steel, hoofbeats tearing through the tilt yard, and then silence broken only by the gasp of onlookers. In January of 1536, King Henry VIII fell from his armored horse during a jousting match at Greenwich. The stallion, nearly a ton of raw muscle, collapsed on top of him. For 2 hours, the monarch lay unconscious, breath shallow, legs crushed beneath iron and flesh. When he finally stirred, something inside him had already begun to rot, not just in mind, but in flesh. His left leg never recovered. A deep wound, torn open in the impact, festered. It became his shadow, never healing, never silent. The ulcer was no ordinary sore. It split his leg open like cracked earth in drought, raw and suppurating. Surgeons of the day, armed with crude instruments and medieval understanding, tried to lance it, drain it, burn it, but nothing closed the wound. It became a festering pit of infection, seeping pus and blood, often swaddled in thick linen soaked through before midday. The stench, according to eyewitness accounts, was unbearably rancid and sweet, the scent of decay wrapped in royal silks. Courtiers began to keep their distance. Attendants lit perfumed candles and burned herbs near his bed, not out of ritual, but necessity. What happens to a man when his own body turns traitor? Henry, once the embodiment of virile strength, was reduced to hiding his leg like a shameful secret. Beneath layers of brocade and ermine, his flesh blackened and bubbled. Infection took hold not just at the surface, but deep within. His gait changed, his temper darkened. His sleep became broken by pain. Each step was a negotiation with agony. This wasn't merely a wound, it was a prophecy of his undoing. And yet, in the royal portraits painted during this period, there is no trace of it. He is still shown standing tall, hands on hips, legs apart, a mountain of regal defiance. But those paintings lie. Behind the canvas, the king was decaying. Some scholars believe the ulcers caused chronic fevers, possibly sepsis, and almost certainly played a role in his ballooning size and worsening mental state. His immune system was at constant war with itself, his bloodstream a highway for slow-moving poison. The ulcer didn't just deform his body, it became the silent architect of his unraveling. Physicians lanced it until it bled and fumed, sometimes inserting gold probes or applying caustic salves that only worsened the agony. Still, the leg refused to heal. Over the next decade, the wound became symbolic and unholy mirror of his reign. What once was strong had festered. What once commanded respect now demanded pity and fear. But the leg was only the beginning. As the rot spread beneath his skin, something far more terrifying was brewing. His limbs may have blistered and bled, but it was his mind warped by pain and fever that would make his final years truly horrifying. Fact 3. A body that could no longer move. By the final years of his reign, Henry VIII, a towering figure of athleticism and regal charisma, had become something monstrous, not in myth but in flesh. The same man who had hunted stags on foot, danced for hours in silken tights, and thrilled crowds in the tilt yard now found himself imprisoned inside a body that refused to obey him. His weight had ballooned beyond 300 pounds, and every step, every motion, became a calculated torment. Where once he had inspired awe with his vigor, now he inspired whispers, muffled behind tapestries and under breathed rumors of winches, pulleys, and specially constructed furniture built not for grandeur, but for survival. A mechanical hoist was installed above his bed, designed to lift his bulk like a wounded warhorse. Servants, once tasked with polishing armor, now managed padded slings and reinforced chairs. A reinforced stool with wheels allowed him to be dragged through his palaces with the dignity of a sack. His legs, plagued by ulcers and engorged by edema, could no longer bear him. The stairs of Whitehall became impassable. He gave up horses entirely. In truth, the once great equestrian could not even mount a donkey. And yet, he remained king. His orders still thundered through England's political corridors, even as his own body fell silent. This grotesque contradiction of absolute power housed in rotting flesh set the stage for one of history's most surreal reigns. His courtiers adapted with morbid creativity. Thrones were widened. Gowns were stitched with breathless tension. Even portraits, once designed to immortalize his glory, were subtly adjusted to mask his decline. But not even the finest artists could fully erase the collapse. His cheeks sagged, his eyes grew heavy. His very presence seemed to warp the air around him with its labored gravity. Imagine a body so heavy it bruised itself from the inside. His thighs chafed until they bled. His skin, stretched too thin over swollen flesh, erupted in boils. The pressure on his chest made sleep a battlefield of gasps and snores. He grew irritable, lashing out in confusion and fury, a tyrant trapped not by his enemies but by his own failing anatomy. And yet, he was not bedridden in the way one imagines a passive invalid. He was still dangerous, still cunning, but his movements were slow, distorted, unnatural. He shifted like a glacier cracking under its own weight, dragging a kingdom with him. His physical immobility echoed a deeper paralysis of the state, of his legacy, of his soul. But the true horror wasn't just that he could no longer move, it was that he couldn't escape. Not from the throne, not from the pain, and certainly not from the decay eating him alive from within. His body had become a tombstone he would inhabit, rotting and resentful, long before the marble vault sealed him underground. Yet even this grotesque physical downfall paled in comparison to what came next: the collapse of his mind. Fact 4. The mind unravels. When Henry VIII fell at Greenwich in 1536, the blow to his body was visible crushed limbs, festering wounds, a leg that would never close again. But what remained unseen may have been far more devastating. For 2 hours, the king lay unconscious, his skull struck with brutal force beneath his helmet. There were no scans, no diagnostics, no knowledge of traumatic brain injury in Tudor medicine. But modern historians now look back on that moment, not just as a physical collapse, but as the start of a slow and merciless unraveling of the king's mind. Before the fall, Henry had been headstrong, proud, ambitious. Afterward, something dark crept in. The changes were not immediate, but they were undeniable. He grew suspicious, vindictive, erratic. Decisions once guided by statecraft now bled with paranoia. Close friends became enemies. Loyal advisors were exiled or beheaded. Wives, once adored, became liabilities discarded or destroyed with increasing speed and theatrical cruelty. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn were devoured by the shadow of a man who no longer trusted anyone. This was not the tyranny of a shrewd strategist. It was the fury of a mind at war with itself. The damage may have affected the frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse, control, and judgment. Henry's moods shifted without warning. He lashed out over imagined slights, issued death warrants without remorse, and often contradicted himself within a single conversation. At court, fear replaced protocol. Men bowed lower. Women held their breath. Everyone, it seemed, was one misstep from the scaffold. And while his body bloated and his leg wept infection, the mind that once balanced diplomacy with dominance spiraled further. He demanded constant control, even as his grasp weakened. Treaties were broken. Wars reignited. Laws rewritten not for justice, but for convenience. His own children became pawns in a game only he understood. Edward elevated. Mary shunned. Elizabeth declared illegitimate, then reinstated. The king's whims became law, and the law became a tool of vengeance. But the most terrifying transformation was not outward, it was internal. He began speaking to ghosts. He muttered of betrayal behind closed doors. He scribbled erratic notes, sometimes crossing out entire paragraphs and replacing them with ink-blotted threats. Reports tell of servants finding him alone in dark chambers, lips moving to no one, fingers twitching as if still gripping a sword long gone. He was not merely aging, he was unraveling. The court could only watch as their monarch, once the embodiment of Renaissance power, became a creature of dread. His throne remained intact, but the man upon it had become something else, a volatile force, more feared than respected, more pitied than obeyed. But the worst part? This decaying mind, fueled by fear and delusion, still held absolute power, and as Henry's sanity slipped further into shadow, his body followed, rotting from the inside out. The mind had shattered. Now the flesh would erupt. Fact 5. The rot within. There was no moment of clean departure, no gentle fading of breath under candlelight. For Henry VIII, death arrived not as a final visitor but as a slow and relentless tenant, taking up residence in his bones, his blood, and his breath. Long before his heart stopped, his body had already begun to die. Chronic infections, seated deep in tissue and sinew, waged war beneath his royal skin. What emerged was not the image of a fading king, but the horror of a man rotting from the inside out. By the final years of his life, the ulcers on his leg were no longer isolated wounds, they were gateways for bacteria, for decay, for corruption. They festered with such violence that physicians could do nothing but drain them daily, releasing not just pus, but blackened fluids that stank of death. The air around him grew thick with gangrenous odor, so potent that even the bravest of his attendants flinched when they entered his chamber. Some began wearing perfumed sleeves over their noses. Others simply avoided him. The king who had once commanded armies now commanded empty rooms and downcast eyes. But the leg was only the beginning. The infection spread, burrowing into his bloodstream, setting off fevers that blurred his thoughts and bloated his frame. His skin discolored, taking on hues of ash, yellow, even green at times. Fluid pooled in his abdomen, his breath rattled with phlegm and rot. In quiet moments, The sound of his body oozing, gurgling, struggling, was said to be more unsettling than his voice, and his voice, once thunderous, now rasped like wind through a broken crypt. This was not disease in the modern sense. There was no clean diagnosis, no sterile treatment. It was medieval agony, manifesting as boils that burst on their own, as sores that refused to crust, as flesh that sloughed off beneath the pressure of bandages. His sheets had to be changed constantly. His undergarments were soaked before midday. The once golden man, painted in armor and sunlight, now lay in bed soaked in his own secretions, a ruin in velvet. Even those who loved him, what few remained, began to fear physical closeness. The intimacy of care turned to a repulsion. None dared speak aloud. Physicians whispered of organ failure, of necrosis, of body systems collapsing one by one like dominoes in a dark corridor. Yet none could stop it. Death had no need to rush. It had already claimed territory in every corner of his flesh. And still, Henry lived. He ruled. He signed decrees and gave orders, his decaying frame wrapped in layers of fabric and ceremony. But beneath the silks, the monarch was dissolving. His body had become a battlefield, and the enemy was not foreign, it was himself. But even as rot clawed at his insides, what came next would push the grotesque beyond human comprehension. Because soon, even death would not be able to contain him. Fact 6. The coffin that couldn't contain him. By the time Henry VIII's body was prepared for transport, it was less a royal corpse and more a swollen vessel of decay, bloated and betraying every law of dignity. His embalming rushed, clumsy, and insufficient had failed to halt the tide of decomposition already surging through him. As the coffin was sealed and set onto the creaking carriage bound for Windsor, there was a grim understanding among the king's handlers. This was not a body being honored, but a burden being moved. The journey was meant to be solemn, measured, shrouded in pageantry. But the body inside was no longer silent. Gases had built up within his abdomen, expanding the belly like a wine bladder left too long in the sun. His limbs had stiffened, then softened again as the tissues broke down. Fluids pooled, organs liquefied, pressure mounted. What followed wasn't simply a mishap, it was an eruption. At Sion Monastery, where the coffin was set to rest for the night, something horrifying occurred. In the silent hours before dawn, beneath vaulted stone ceilings and flickering candlelight, the coffin burst. Cracks formed along its seams. Black, foul-smelling liquid ooze from the rotting king seeped out in trails across the stone floor. It soaked the linen wrappings, stained the wood, and released into the air a stench so overpowering that even the most hardened attendants gagged. There was no longer any illusion of preservation. The coffin had become a cauldron of royal corruption. But then came the story, part legend, part chilling metaphor. A stray dog, drawn by the scent, was said to have entered the chapel and licked the royal fluids from the floor. Whether fact or moral invention, the tale spread like wildfire. Chroniclers later recorded it with thinly veiled revulsion, evoking the biblical image of King Ahab, the cursed ruler of Israel, whose blood was licked by dogs after his death as divine punishment. Henry, too, had defied the church, spilled blood by decree, and ruled with cruelty masked as command. Now, even in death, he could not escape the judgment of symbols. What made the moment more terrifying wasn't the gore, it was the implication. The most powerful man in England, the architect of royal supremacy, the self-styled godly king, had become a spectacle of decay so public, so vivid, that even animals claimed his remains. His body, once exalted and guarded with awe, had spilled out into the open, staining not only the floor but his memory. The procession continued to Windsor, but the myth had already taken root. No mask could erase it. No herald could drown it out. Henry's coffin, cracked and leaking, had turned into an altar of consequence, his death echoing not with solemnity, but with dread. And still, even after this rupture of flesh and symbol, the story of his burial was not finished. Because what lay waiting beneath Windsor Chapel was not a tomb built for kings but something far less worthy. Fact 7. The tomb that wasn't his. Henry VIII, the king who shattered a continent's faith to forge his own divine authority, spent his reign building monuments to self. He commissioned towering palaces, curated portraits of mythic grandeur, and envisioned a mausoleum that would rival the pyramids in permanence. He imagined a tomb carved in white marble, adorned with gilded effigies, saints cast in silver, and an eternal flame that would burn forever at its heart. But when the time came to bury him, there was no flame, no monument, no finished tomb. There was only a borrowed stone and silence. After his death and the grotesque episode at Sion, Henry's body was lowered into a vault beneath St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The chamber was never designed for a king. In fact, it had been originally intended for Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's former Lord Chancellor, whom he had disgraced and destroyed when ambition outgrew allegiance. That same sarcophagus, cold and waiting, became Henry's final dwelling. The irony clung to it like mildew. The conqueror of clerics was buried in the tomb of a priest he had betrayed. The vault itself was Sparcino regal canopy. No golden effigy, no triumphant inscription. His remains were placed beside those of Jane Seymour, his third wife and the only one to bear him a son. She had died in childbirth and had long rested in quiet dignity beneath the chapel floor. Now, the king who once claimed the heavens bent to his will was laid beside her, hidden beneath flagstones walked on by generations of worshippers who had no idea a monarch slept below. His grand tomb had never materialized, funds had dried up, political will had shifted. The war-hardened realities of his later reign had consumed resources and interest. There were blueprints, yes, volumes of intricate plans archived and forgotten, but no stones laid, no craftsmen summoned. Henry's death had not inspired awe or pilgrimage. It had been hurried, concealed, and ultimately forgotten in the architecture of state. For centuries, the location remained unmarked. Tourists and royals passed overhead unaware. It wasn't until modern renovations and archival studies that the details became clearer. The final resting place of England's most infamous king was not a throne of stone, but a footnote in a cold chapel crypt. Legacy had been everything to him. He had rewritten theology, burned libraries, broken queens and brothers to ensure his name would echo through eternity. But his grave says otherwise. The physical symbol of his afterlife, the tomb he believed would anchor his soul in reverence, was never built. The sarcophagus that holds him belonged to another man, and the vault that cradles his bones is shared, unadorned, and utterly forgettable. But even this indignity was not the final humiliation, because before death took him fully, Henry's mind had already begun to unravel in terror not of pain, but of something far deeper. The King of England, who once defied the heavens, was now trembling before them. Fact 8. A king's final terror. In the final days of Henry VIII's life, it was not the plague, or rebellion, or foreign invasion that haunted him. It was judgment. Not political, not historical, divine. The once defiant monarch who had torn Christendom in two, who declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, now lay in a bed soaked in his own rot, muttering prayers to a God he had once claimed to overrule. His swollen body trembled not with pain, but with fear of what came next. As death crept closer, Henry demanded that Catholic and Protestant rites be performed side by side. He ordered daily masses said in his chambers, sometimes multiple in a single morning. Latin chants echoed through the corridors of Whitehall, a desperate litany from a man who no longer knew which God he should beg for mercy. Was it the God of Rome he had rejected? Or the God of reform he had reshaped in his own brutal image? He confessed repeatedly, obsessively, not in a singular, noble gesture, but in fits of incoherence and anxiety. He whispered of sins that courtiers dared not repeat, of blood that would not wash from his hands, of voices some real, some not, that reminded him of the wives he had buried and the friends he had betrayed. The man who had once mocked monks now surrounded himself with clergy, each carrying not just sacraments, but the heavy expectation of absolution. But nothing cleansed him. The fever boiled in his brain, and the infections pulsed in his veins, dragging his mind into nightmarish lucidity. He spoke of fire, of swords, of mothers weeping. He clutched rosaries while denying Rome. He ordered scripture read aloud, then tore at his sheets in agony. His spiritual paranoia knew no doctrine, only dread. He was the architect of religious revolution, yet in his final hours he resembled a penitent caught between two collapsing worlds, crying out to a sky that offered no reply. This was not piety, it was terror, the kind of terror that grips only those who once believed themselves untouchable. Henry, who had annulled papal supremacy, who had rewritten doctrine with the sweep of a quill, now begged invisible forces for peace. His council dared not question him. They nodded, lit candles, and called for priests anything to calm the convulsions of a king facing the one power he could never command, the eternal. And still, despite the prayers and rituals, his expression never softened. His breath came in rattled gasps. His eyes darted to corners of the room where no one stood. He was not dying quietly. He was fighting tooth and nail against a reckoning he had spent a lifetime delaying. What had started as a monarch's reign was ending as a condemned man's spiral. And as he neared the edge of that unknown dark, even his physical body began to betray the desperation of his soul, because the decay would not wait. And soon, not even God would want to be near him. Fact 9. A botched embalming. When the body of King Henry VIII finally surrendered to death, it was already a battlefield lost. The physicians and embalmers who approached him did not find the solemn stillness of a sovereign's passing. They found a storm of decomposition already in motion. Time was against them. The rot had begun days, perhaps weeks before the final breath. His swollen belly, ulcerated limbs, and septic flesh left no grace for ceremony. What followed was not preservation, it was containment. And even that failed. Embalming in the 16th century was a crude science. It required time, skill, and a body that hadn't already become a vessel of infection. But Henry's corpse was none of these. The embalmers, panicked by the stench, hurried their work. They packed his cavities with herbs and rags, salted his skin, and anointed him with aromatic oils. But these were rituals of desperation, not effectiveness. The abdomen, distended with gas and fluid, resisted pressure. The legs had hardened with edema. His face had begun to slacken, jaw sinking, skin mottling with the bloom of internal collapse. Reports from those tasked with his preparations spoke in veiled horror. The stench was described as so vile that no incense could mask it. His skin, once regal and flushed with power, had turned a patchwork of bruised purple and green. The eyes, half-lidded and glassy, refused to close without force. His mouth had to be bound shut. And worst of all, his limbs began to leak thick, black fluid seeping from folds and wounds that the embalmers could not plug in time. The swelling distorted his features beyond recognition. His nose collapsed inward. The cheeks sagged. The king's infamous jawline, once carved into paintings like a symbol of Tudor dominance, was now sunken and soft, as if the skull beneath had begun to dissolve. They wrapped him in haste, not reverence. The coffin was sealed under pressure, as much to suppress odor as to convey dignity. And yet, the rot would not be silenced. By the time he was laid in state, few dared linger. The chamber was dressed in darkness, not just for mourning but to disguise the deformities beneath the shroud. No open casket, no farewell kiss, no royal subjects lined to see the face of a king. Instead, there was distance, fear, a forced reverence delivered through clenched jaws and scented handkerchiefs. Henry had once commanded the hands of artists to sculpt him into myth portraits of immortal virility, of imperial glory. But now, even the artisans of death could not mask what he had become. His embalming was not a preservation, it was a failure written in fetid breath and liquefied skin. And though the coffin was sealed, it would not hold. The consequence of their haste was yet to erupt. Because what had been hastily packed away in shadows would soon force its way into daylight, staining not just cloth and wood, but the final memory of a monarch consumed by his own flesh. Fact 10. No death mask, no glory. In a time when the faces of monarchs were immortalized in plaster, cast in stillness as their final expression of power and remembrance, Henry VIII left behind nothing. No official death mask was ever Medeir. If it was, none survived. For a man who had controlled his image with tyrannical precision, who commissioned endless portraits and carved his legend into the fabric of an entire era, this absence is more than peculiar. It is a void that echoes. Edward III, Richard II, Charles I all, left behind masks that preserve their countenance, their myth, their memory. Death masks were not merely mementos, they were monuments in miniature, tangible relics of sovereignty, cast within hours of death before the skin could fall slack. They were sacred objects, political tools, and acts of visual resurrection. Yet for the most iconic Tudor king, there is no such artifact, no mold, no imprint. no plaster likeness of Henry's final expression. Why? The theories are grim. Some point to the grotesque state of his corpse, so disfigured by bloating, collapse, and infection that any attempt to preserve his features would have resulted in horror, not homage. The embalming, already failed, had left his face distorted, his nose crushed, his mouth sealed shut by force. Casting such a face would not have yielded a king, it would have captured a monster. Others suggest the omission was political. Henry's death came at a precarious moment in Tudor succession. His son Edward was only 9 years old. The court was in flux. Power was fragile. There may have been a conscious decision to erase the final image of a man who had become too frightening to revere. A death mask would have revealed the truth, that the king who defied Rome, beheaded queens, and declared himself the very image of majesty had died in disgraceful ruin. No loyal courtier wanted that vision preserved in plaster. No faction vying for influence wanted to be associated with such decay. And so, the final mask of Henry VIII is not one of wax or marble. It is absence. His last image remains hidden, his face buried not just beneath stone, but beneath layers of political shame and physical horror. The icon of an empire left behind no trace but rot. What lingers instead are painted lice portraits captured decades earlier, where he still towers with steely eyes and splayed legs, hands gripping his belt like the god of his own creation. But those images are fantasy. The man who died in January of 1547 was no longer a god, nor even a king. He was a bloated, leaking carcass sealed in borrowed stone, too far gone to preserve, too dangerous to show. And in that final Omishano mask, no likeness, no face to haunt the future Henry VIII, vanished into the silence he once tried to conquer. The king who reshaped the world could not control the memory of his own end.